This is a podcast by WellHouse Church, where we take a closer look and dig a little deeper into this week's sermon. What's going on, Bible nerds?
What's up?
We're talking about Moses again, so let's take a closer look.
Yep. Let's do it. I think this is our last week in Restoration Stories. We've been in it since Easter, so early April, and here we are, late May. So we've been at it for a while, and I think we've just reached the time where it's time to move into starting our summer content and just changing the pace a little bit. But this is a really interesting story for me. So we're only doing one verse out of Hebrews 11. And this is what the text says. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. It's Moses who has the faith to raise the staff.
Yeah.
It's not the people. The people are groaning. The people are complaining.
Right.
You should have left us in Egypt because at least then we wouldn't die. Faith doesn't come without doubt.
Right.
I think it's been a problem in the church that we've said that somehow
Having faith means also not having any doubts.
correct.
Yeah.
And that's just not correct. These people just saw 10 magnificent plagues that God put in place so that they could have restoration. Literally just before this. And yet they get to this point and they're doubting.
Well, and I think we've talked about this before, but at some level, we all have doubts about everything in life. Even if you have these massive monuments to point back to that God did this, God took care of me during this hardship. When you face something similar down the road, it's not totally out of character for you to still have doubt.
Yeah, well, and what I would say is when you face crisis, these people are in a moment of crisis.
Absolutely.
They've reached a sea. They know there's no way to cross, and they see the Egyptians bearing down on them with their armies. They know that they're about to be obliterated.
Yeah, which is hard.
They are in a moment of crisis, of trauma, and they have doubt.
Yeah.
And we've talked a lot on all of our WellHouse podcasts, but trauma is very significant.
Yeah.
That idea that trauma is something reserved for rape victims and veterans has just been debunked at this point.
Yeah.
Trauma is unique to each individual person, and every person has trauma, even if for another person it wouldn't merit as trauma.
Yeah.
It's trauma to them. These people are definitely in a state of trauma and crisis and have been for many years as slaves.
Yeah. And severe trauma.
Yeah.
Severe.
And they reach this point and they say, man, we're going to die.
Yeah.
They don't carry themselves as a prototype of who we would look at and say those people have faith. But Hebrews 11 shows us that they do have faith. And interesting, I've talked about this a lot, but in Matthew 28, right before the Great Commission, they're up on this mountain, and the text says, I'm gonna open it for us, but the text says that they're there and they're worshiping, but some doubted. This is Matthew 28, right before the Great Commission. Verse 16, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Faith and doubt are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
You can have faith and have doubts.
Yeah.
There's nothing that says you can't. I think we all do. And I'm actually not even going to say that's an unhealthy place, because as we deal with crisis and trauma in our lives, we get pushed into a corner and we don't know how to get out. We don't see a way that God will provide.
Yeah.
And so we doubt. And hear me, listener, that's okay. That's not to say it's the best way, but it's an acceptable way.
Sure.
There's no reason that we should think less of ourselves because we find ourselves in places of doubt. Now, my good friend and mentor, Sean Palmer, I saw him post something on Twitter the other day, and he's like, we shouldn't just say that we're doubting because doubting is the quote-unquote cool thing to do.
Right.
But there are people who have a lot of doubts and who struggle in their faith, and those are the people that WellHouse is for.
Yeah.
Those are the people that we designed it for. And so I know majority of our listeners find themselves in that place. Faith and doubt are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they often go hand in hand, because in order to worship, you must have faith. But just because you worship doesn't mean you doubt. Mm. In the same way, we experience this in the Exodus story. And they reach this point where their back's against the wall.
Yeah.
They don't see a way out, and they're doubting. And Moses, it only takes one person to have this immense amount of faith. And Moses has this faith. And the text says he raises his staff, and the Red Sea parts. But here's the thing about that text that I love so much. So this is in Exodus chapter 14. And they're griping and doing all this stuff. And the army's bearing down on them. This is verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the water forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." And then, skipping down to verse 27, so Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depths. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. Here's the thing that I think is so interesting about the text. Did you notice that it said they walked on dry land? Mm-hmm. Now, I can imagine that whatever kind of sediment is at the bottom of this sea, if you removed the water from it, it would still be wet. It would still be
slippery,
soupy and marshy and that kind of thing. But the text says that they walked on dry land. And this is extremely comforting for me. In moments of crisis, whether there's faith and or doubt, God makes complete provision.
Yeah. I would spin it this way as well, that he provides a firm foundation. Mm. You know, that you don't have to walk in these soupy, slippery.
Yeah.
It's a firm, solid, dry foundation.
Yeah. I think we get in these moments and we let our situations determine our status. Mm. That's what they do, right? Do you see them coming at us? They're going to kill us. We're dead.
Yeah.
They let their situation determine their status. But I don't think that's actually how it plays out most of the time. I think if we really look at the text, what we see time and time again is God's provision, and not God's limited provision, but complete provision.
Yeah.
For the things that he wants, he provides completely for. And he promised restoration. So he provides complete restoration. Can you imagine how hard it would be to trek this caravan of people through this soupy, muddy mess at the bottom of this sea? It'd be very hard.
Well, think about wagons and carts. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be very difficult.
It'd be nearly impossible.
Yeah, it would be nearly impossible. And so God says, I'm going to give this firm foundation. I'm going to give this dry land because I am providing complete restoration. I didn't just give you the way forward.
Yeah.
I gave you the steps to take.
Yeah.
I gave you the path to walk. I gave you everything you needed to make it to restoration.
Yeah.
And notice, that happens in spite of the doubt of the Israelites.
Yeah.
Moses in the story is the only one that has the faith. And this happens in spite of all of their doubting.
Gosh, it's cold in here.
Yeah. It reminds me of the story where when Jesus calms the storm. Because if you remember that story, the disciples are panicking.
Yeah.
Because they see the storm, they see the boat, they see everything. They're very aware of their situation. And they let their situation determine their status. They go to Jesus and say, do you not care that we're about to die?
Yeah.
Their situation determined their status. Whereas Jesus stands up and speaks and says, hey, your decisions don't determine your destiny. I determine your destiny. If I've promised restoration, that's my promise to you.
Yeah.
It's going to come. In spite of your struggles and doubts and faith, I think time and time again, the only time in the text where we see that God is not faithful to his promise is when he is outrightly rejected.
Yeah.
So think about when Jesus commissions his disciples to go out 2 by 2, and he says, if you ever enter a city where they reject you, dust your feet and go on to the next one. Time and time and time again, we see repeatedly that God is completely faithful to his promises of restoration. And your doubts, your struggles, your questions don't hinder that for you.
Well, and I think we need to phrase it a way that we have phrased another thing. God is big enough to handle your doubts, right? Like we talk about that with questions.
Yeah.
God is big enough to handle your doubts.
Yeah.
Because if you have questions, lots of times there's doubt there.
Yeah.
Right? And it's okay.
Yeah.
It's tough. Having questions and having doubts is tough, but it's an okay place to be because we've all been there.
Yeah.
In some ways, I think we're all always there.
Yeah.
There's always things that we're questioning and always things that we have doubts about. And God makes a way.
Yeah.
He provides complete restoration. You may not ever get an answer to all of your questions.
Yeah.
And that's also okay.
Yeah. I think, so here's what I would say. I think doubts and questions come with the territory.
Yeah.
That's not to say they're ideal.
No.
I do think the ideal is what Jesus says, childlike faith.
Yep.
But we don't live in a world of ideals.
Nope.
We live in a world where we have questions and we have doubts and we struggle with faith. And honestly, if faith were easy, don't you think everyone would do it?
Mm.
But faith's not easy. It puts limitations on us. It requires things from us. It requires us to understand that we're not living for ourselves anymore. There are a lot of things that happen with faith and living a life of faith just by its very nature that can lead to doubt and questions.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to go deep in our archives. Remember the Because of Faith series?
Yeah.
It requires action.
Yeah.
Faith requires action.
Hence why Moses raises his hand.
Yeah. Faith requires you to step out. And sometimes that's hard.
Yeah.
And if Moses had doubt,
Yeah.
he wouldn't have raised his hand, his arm.
Yeah.
But all the Israelites standing behind him were like, hey, bro, that's ridiculous. What is that going to do?
Yeah. It's a very strange thing that when we, and specifically, I love this text because it puts us in a context of trauma and crisis.
Mm.
We all go through moments of trauma and crisis.
Yeah.
Job loss, divorce, loss of a relative, death, mourning, grieving,
Sickness.
You name it. We all have experiences of trauma. And when you get in these experiences of trauma or crisis, you don't see a way forward. Mm-hmm. Your back's against the wall and you don't see a way out of it. And you are in panic. Mm. Moses, why'd you do this? Moses, you should have just left us there. We were fine. But sometimes it's in the pressure cooker that we find the tenderness of God.
What's that age-old example of the pressure creating diamonds?
Yeah. Put carbon under pressure. Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard that countless times about God, like the refiner's fire type deal, right? And that's what's happening.
Yeah,
here.
Absolutely.
And that's what, when you're experiencing that pressure, when you're experiencing the flames of the refiner's fire, God's trying to work on you. He's trying to build your faith muscle. And that's a way that we need to think about it, is faith is like a muscle.
Yeah.
You can't just become a Christian and, like, say you're baptized one day and then the next day, like, you're just full of faith, right? Like, that just isn't how it works.
Nope. Or you might be for a little bit.
Well, yeah. But I promise you, the first bit of trauma that you come to, that faith muscle you're going to realize is pretty small.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you use the metaphor of a muscle, because how does a muscle work?
You got to use it to build it.
Well, not just that. A muscle works off tension.
Oh, yeah.
Everything about a muscle works off tension.
Mm.
Tension's required for it to be a muscle.
Yeah.
And so in the same way, tension is required for the strengthening of our faith.
Yeah.
And
also think about, the whole idea of lifting weights is tearing apart those muscle fibers.
Yeah.
So that they grow back.
Yeah.
You literally have to destroy it for it to come back stronger.
Experiencing brokenness and crisis and trauma leads to a building of faith that yields restoration. Yeah. Now, sometimes we can experience restoration in ways that we wouldn't normally. Like maybe your marriage won't actually end in divorce. Maybe God can restore that through some hard work and dedication from both of you. But there are other times where sometimes the marriage does dissolve. And you have to experience brokenness in order to rebuild. Yeah. And Here's the thing I want to end with. You know, we've talked about that when God promises restoration, he provides completely. He takes care of every asset. He takes care of every facet. He takes care of everything for restoration. But also, these moments of crisis, these moments of faith, these moments that we can look back to, they move forward with us. They shape our faith. These moments where our backs are against the wall, where we're in crisis, where we don't see restoration, where we don't know where God is, they become moments that shape who we are as people of faith. So much so that God tells the Israelites, hey, build a monument. Build a monument to remember this day where I provided restoration for you. Because you're going to come back to these moments. You're going to have more crisis. You're going to have more trauma because we live in a broken and fallen world.
Yeah.
But build a monument because these moments where you're in crisis and God provides shape your character as a person of faith.